Welcome back. You're watching Andrew Pearce on GBNews. Well, it's been a chaotic few months for the government, let alone the country, and the Conservatives are still polling woefully low figures, with all polling suggesting if there were an election today or tomorrow, they'd be out of office and out on their ear. Labour leader Keir Starmer would be the first Labour Prime Minister since Gordon Brown, who, of course, was forced out of left office in 2010. However, there do seem to be some signs of progression under Rishi Sunak, with the latest poll from Redfield and Wilton cutting Labour's lead down to 17 points, with Labour on 47 and the Conservatives 30%. Still a significant lead, but greatly down on some of those polls in October, which had Labour's lead in the high 30s. So is it a sign Sunak is enjoying some sort of bounce? Joining me now in the studio is GBNews polling analyst David Cowling. David, it's a measure of where we are now with this government that the idea they're only 17 points behind is seen as rather good news.
You're absolutely right. And if you're drowning, any plank that's thrown to you or any shred of wood is to be grasped. I think the polls, more seriously, the polls are showing some recovery for the Conservatives, but once again, as you rightly say, it's a very deep hole they're in. Rishi Sunak coming in to replace the rather hapless Liz Truss, one would expect a bit of that.
Rather hapless is the understatement of the year.
Thank you. I'm in a charitable mood, uncharacteristically today. But yes, so one would expect something to come back there. Also, when one reads below the headline figures of the voting intention, Sunak has recovered in several of the polls. He's now briefly a bit ahead of Starmer on the best PM. The Conservatives are recovering a bit on the question of the best to handle the economy. So they're becoming more competitive. But I suspect, Andrew, that the biggest problem they're going to face is that the Bank of England forecast of yesterday. So we now appear going to have the longest recession on record and 10% inflation that's going to take us through, it seems, until the summer of next year. Now, if Rishi Sunak can redeem that, if he can restore our fortunes, history may be very kind to him, but the voters who have to endure the medicine may not. So I think for him, these early signs are encouraging, and for the party, of course they are, and they may build on them. But we're still, as you rightly say, in some very deep and dire territory, and we've got some pretty heavy headwinds ahead of them.
Now, we know interest rates are going up around the world, whether it's from Arkansas to Aberdeen, but the difficulty the Prime Minister's going to have here is some voters will associate this rise in mortgage rates when the fixed-term mortgages end, the people in the next months ahead, some people could be facing thousands of pounds more in their mortgages. Are they going to blame the Conservatives for that because of the way Miss Liz Truss's mini-budget, unravelled in the eyes of the city? The city was spooked and forced up early interest rates.
I suspect that probably people will tend to blame the government. They have that tendency in the past. But also, if you see it as part of a cocktail of other problems, the previous segment where you had Tom talking, you know, some of the things that are coming down the road, which the government has to do in order to restore fortunes, as they would say, aren't going to be popular. So if my mortgage is going up, and everything else is fine, I might be a bit sort of philosophical about it. But if my mortgage is going up, as well as high inflation, as well as high energy costs and the rest of it, it becomes a potentially quite toxic mix for the government to overcome. And I think the resentment, for dint of anything else, the laser beam will concentrate on the government.
We shouldn't forget the NHS is another crisis all on its own. But when you look at those polls, we see the slight recovery for the Conservatives. We know the people who tend to vote Conservative are older people. They've often paid off their mortgage. They've got savings in the bank. Interest rates going up will actually help them because the deposits they're getting on their build inside your bank accounts will increase. But the trouble is they're talking about getting rid of the triple lock, which ensures actually that pensions go up in line with inflation. That will be politically, potentially, a catastrophic decision for a Conservative government that relies on the grey vote to get them into number 10.
Certainly sort of aiming your guns at your core supporters isn't necessarily the most successful political strategy. But again, perhaps it's a reflection of the world in which he finds himself, that he's now become Prime Minister. He was Chancellor, as we know, and he was Father Christmas for about 18 months.
Yes, he was.
and very popular.
The furlough scheme?
Absolutely, very, very popular.
Eat out to help out?
Absolutely, very popular things to do. But now Father Christmas is becoming Scrooge.
Yes.
And it's going to be interesting to see whether the public, in a sense, bites the bullet, bites its tongue and goes with him, realising that we're in a mess and these things need to be done, or whether they start building up a sense of resentment because they see no end to the individual dilemmas they face.
What about that other old age question for all governments, David? They've been in power for a very long time. It feels like they've been in power for a very long time. They're tired, they're running out of steam. It could be 14 years at the next election. Won't there be lots of people who just think, that's it, time for a change? Very difficult to counter that argument.
It is. I think John Major famously said that when they won 92, unexpectedly, the 92 election, he said he thought they'd stretched the democratic elastic too far. So it will be a very long time. However, I would only caution it. In our lifetime, I'm 1,000 years older than you, but...
but you don't look it.
You're very kind. There were tribal voting.
Yeah.
Blocks of Conservatives, blocks were virtually immovable. Now, all of that is shattered. In the 2015, 2017, 2010, 2015, 2017 elections, 3 elections within 7 years of each other, 50% of the people who voted in all of those 3 elections did not vote for the same party in all of them. So the certainties of my youth have just disintegrated. The reason I say that is that I think for many members of the public, it's become much more transactional politics rather than tribal. And so it's not beyond the possibility of the Conservatives reforming themselves. They did famously with John Major. Everybody was talking about time's up. But somehow his election made people feel, and replacement of Thatcher, new government. So they'd had the election, hadn't they? Yeah. So that was the benefit. Now, I don't say that's anything like possible necessarily, but he has a historical precedent to look to. But nevertheless, what you say is I'm sure correct. There's truth in it, and it just becomes another element of the charge sheet that he's got to address.